We sold the house, we signed the debt, we called it freedom. We forgot the flag. Now we move, and move, and move. Eulogy for a Young Nation. From the Station Substack by Frederick Falloon, May 1st, 2025. There is a quiet kind of anxiety that afflicts people when they no longer know what home is, when the coordinates of identity dissolve and all that remains is motion without direction. You see it in the eyes of young New Zealanders. Not panic, not outrage, just a certain restlessness, a thin, persistent ache, as if some invisible structure has collapsed behind them and no one is allowed to name it. This essay is not about economics, at least not directly. It is about the aftertaste of material decline, the cultural, spiritual, and psychological debris that accumulates when a country ceases to be a country, but forgets to tell its children, because that is what happened here. The houses are still standing. The banks still lend. The supermarkets are full, but the story is gone, and young people, even those who can't articulate it, are living in the absence of a myth that once held this place together. The loss is rarely said, but always spoken. It lives between the lines, in sleeplessness, in aimlessness, in the wandering from gig job to diploma to overseas visa, in the inability to form commitments to a partner, to a community, to a future. They are told they are free, but free to do what? They do not know because no one ever told them what New Zealand was for. There was once a myth, not a fairy tale, not a propaganda reel. A myth in the proper sense, a shared story about who we are, where we come from, and what this land means. It was rough-edged, yes, settler, Protestant, self-reliant, quiet, a little severe. But it gave shape to life. It gave dignity to labor. It said, "This is our place, and we must make something of it." Today, that myth is gone, dismantled, discredited, or simply forgotten. In its place, diversity, openness, optionality, consumption. But none of those are stories. They are policies, moods, marketing slogans. The modern New Zealander grows up in a place that has abandoned teleology, no purpose, only movement. The country makes no demands of him and offers no covenant in return. He is a consumer, a renter, a temporary worker in the marketplace of nations. His values are provisional, his loyalties conditional, his identity outsourced. This is not freedom. It is vertigo. The old myths of home, of belonging, of nationhood were not perfect, but they gave people something to inherit, something to carry, something to rise or fall against. The new regime offers no such burden and no such honor. It tells you to be whatever you want, as long as you don't believe it too strongly. Is it any wonder, then, that anxiety is the default condition of an entire generation? That therapy is now a rite of passage, and SSRIs more common than wedding rings? When the only thing young people are given is debt, transience, and a Spotify-wrapped playlist, what precisely are they meant to build? You cannot found a life on vibes. You cannot found a nation on economic growth alone. What the young feel, what they cannot quite name, is the trauma of deracination. They have been untethered not just from home ownership or job security, but from the idea of belonging to a coherent people in a meaningful place. They are not mad at this. They do not burn cars or riot in the streets. They simply float, and in time, they leave. Australia takes them, Canada takes them, or they move to Queenstown for a season, Wellington for a contract, Auckland for a side hustle. Each move a further dissociation from something that no longer holds. No politician will speak of this, no economist will model it. But if you pay attention, you'll feel it everywhere. A low-level hum of civilizational unease. A young man who has never heard his country described in a way that commands his loyalty. A young woman who feels ashamed of her roots, but is offered nothing to root into. A student who graduates into debt and abstraction. A worker who finds dignity in nothing. There is no rebellion coming. Only the long slide into collective amnesia. And yet, it could be otherwise. A people who remember their myth can revive it. They can rebuild what was lost, not by repeating the past, but by acknowledging it with respect. They can say, "This was our home, this was our inheritance, and we are not content to be the final link in a broken chain. A country that tells no story dies. A people without memory becomes a population. New Zealand, if it is to exist, must find its voice again, not in slogans or targets, but in meaning. The young don't need a higher minimum wage. They need to know what it means to be here and why that should matter. Until then, they will drift, and the country will drift with them, politely, peacefully, quietly, into nothing at all. What caused that drift is not a mystery. It was not some sudden cultural revolution. It was something older, colder, and much more bureaucratic. It was a decision, not by a mob but by a class, to dismantle the productive base of the nation and to sell off the myth that held it together. And like all economic decisions, it left a paper trail. Because once, not long ago, New Zealand was a country that produced. This is not nostalgia. It is a matter of public record. The New Zealand of the mid-20th century was not a postmodern consumption depot. It was a functioning, if imperfect, developmental state. It built its own infrastructure, employed its own people, printed its own credit, and fed and clothed itself. The state owned the railways, the power grid, the phone system, the airline, the coal mines, the post office. The economy was not efficient in the modern sense, but it was coherent. Tariffs protected local manufacturing. Public banks financed home ownership and regional growth. The Reserve Bank was tasked with national development, not anchoring inflation expectations. In 1950, manufacturing employed 1 in 4 workers. You could trace a straight line between what people did during the day and what the country needed to exist. Productivity growth and wage growth moved together. Debt levels were modest. The young could afford homes without needing to speculate. The economy, such as it was, supported the myth of New Zealand. It gave material expression to that unspoken promise that if you were born here and worked here, you belonged here. But a different logic was waiting in the wings. In 1984, with the fourth Labour government, the new class arrived. The managerial technocrats, the consultants, the globalizers. They spoke the language of openness, efficiency, reform. In practice, they tore out the foundation. Tariffs were slashed. State-owned enterprises were corporatized and sold, often to foreign buyers. Telecom, rail, the Bank of New Zealand, the ports, even the forests. The Reserve Bank was made independent in 1989 and forbidden from caring about employment or national development. Its only legal task, price stability. At the time, it was a triumph. Mises had taught that intervention distorted prices, that only the unchained market could find its natural equilibrium. Rothbard argued that every state action, however mild, was a coercion against peaceful association. Hayek warned that every encroachment, even the smallest, was a step onto the road to serfdom. We were told that freedom, real freedom, demanded that the state retreat from economic life. That if capital could move without restriction, if individuals could transact without memory, if policy could be severed from sentiment, prosperity would arise spontaneously, as naturally as the tides. I believed this, as many of my generation did. It was beautiful in theory, clear, rational, frictionless. And had we been a people bound by loyalty, history, and soil, it might even have worked. But we were not that people anymore. We did not see, or refused to see, that once the state withdrew, it would not be communities or craftsmen who filled the vacuum, but speculators, consultants, foreign capital, and rootless managerial clerks. A market without borders is not a market of citizens, it is a market of clients. Price signals, absent loyalty, will auction off anything, land, memory, sovereignty, and call it efficiency. The theory worked perfectly. It was the reality that collapsed. Then came the immigration reforms, the 1991 shift to a points-based system. Migration became less about nation building and more about GDP filling. The more people you could import, the more housing demand you could inflate. And housing, by the mid-1990s, was becoming the new economy. Bank lending shifted away from business and industry toward mortgages. In 2023, over 60% of all bank credit flows into residential property. We currently do not build wealth by making things. We build it by bidding against one another. The results are visible in the statistics. In 1990, the median house price in New Zealand was $105,000. In 2021, it passed $930,000. Real wages, meanwhile, have stagnated. Productivity growth has averaged less than 1% annually since the early 1990s. Home ownership among under 40s has collapsed. Student debt has replaced industrial apprenticeships. And all the while, the political class congratulates itself for economic growth. But GDP is not a country. And what grew was not the productive base, it was the paper value of land, the volume of credit, and the headcount of those whose lives are now priced out of what was once their home. It is no coincidence that the national mood grew hollow as the national economy turned speculative. The young feel it, not as policy, but as atmosphere. They are not educated to trace its origin, but they know something broke. The promise once implicit in citizenship, that loyalty, effort, and participation would yield a place in the future, has quietly expired. The myth that held the nation together was never just cultural. It had an economic stomach. And when the structure beneath it was dismantled, the meaning collapsed with it. But this collapse was not spontaneous. It did not drift down from the heavens or erupt from below. It came through the quiet replacement of a ruling class. For all their parochialism and paternalism, New Zealand once had a native elite, provincial, yes, but rooted. Farmers, engineers, industrialists, union leaders, bureaucrats. They were not virtuous, not modern. They could be insular, slow, arrogant, but they lived here. They spoke like us. Their fortunes rose and fell with the country. If New Zealand failed, they failed with it. By the mid-1990s, they were gone. In their place, consultants, transnationals, wealth managers, policy technocrats, and property developers. The new class does not rule as stewards. It operates as brokers, brokering deals, brokering consensus, brokering us. They are not capitalists in the old sense. They do not build firms, assume risk, or create productive infrastructure. Nor are they traditional mandarins, whose power derived from historical continuity or public legitimacy. They are a class of intermediaries, whose entire existence depends on movement, capital flows, labor churn, policy reform, consultancy turnover, migration volume, urban development, asset revaluation. Their purpose is not to produce, but to rearrange, to optimize, restructure, rezone, rebrand. And when the optimization fails, they move on to another project, another consultancy, another government contract, another offshore holding. Their wealth is not in factories, but in property portfolios. Their status is not rooted in service, but in language, in their mastery of the dialect of global best practice. The old elite made things. The new elite manages perception, and perception, unlike production, can be outsourced. What replaced the productive economy was not just speculation, it was rule by abstraction. Power retreated from the tangible to the intangible. The physical economy, the workshop, the plant, the port, became secondary to the spreadsheet, the model, the dashboard metric. Legitimacy was no longer earned by building something. It was awarded by narrative alignment. The farm was replaced by the consultancy, the workshop by the policy brief, the town hall by the RBNZ press release. It would be comforting to say this was done to us by foreign agents, but the truth is harder. It was done for foreign agents, by locals who no longer saw themselves as custodians of a country, but as franchise managers in a global system. And once that class took power, it became almost impossible to speak of national interest without sounding nostalgic or worse, provincial. The new elite, after all, doesn't want to hear about national interest. It wants stable credit markets, high trust statistics, and a housing pipeline. It wants New Zealand to remain clean, quiet, and polite, a model jurisdiction. Because, in their eyes, New Zealand isn't a country. It's a product, and we, the people still living in it, are either brand assets or cost centers. That's why no one governs anymore. They administer. That's why no one builds anymore. They zone. That's why no one defends anything, because there is no we left to defend. The dream of a serious sovereign New Zealand didn't die in a revolution. It was dissolved in a consultancy contract. And so we live in a country where the farms are owned by equity funds, the houses by speculators, the policies by MBIE, the children by the algorithm, and no one, anywhere in that chain, feels responsible for what happens next. We did not lose the nation, we outsourced it. And in doing so, we lost the very class whose job was to remember what it meant. A nation that builds is a nation that believes. A nation that speculates is a nation that forgets. And we, polite, well-behaved, high-trust New Zealand, have forgotten. We forgot what it was to produce, to own the means of our future, to direct credit not to landlords but to builders, to protect industry, not out of fear, but out of duty. We forgot what it was to shape a nation for its people, rather than shape its people for international rankings. And now, like all those raised in a home that was sold while they were still living in it, we wander the rooms as tenants, wondering what happened, afraid to ask who owns the deed. But the records remain, and history is not yet irreversible. If there is to be recovery, if this place is to be something more than a finance park with a flag, then we must begin not with slogans, but with memory. This was a productive country. It was sovereign. It was serious. It belonged to us, and it still can.